Are you struggling to create an intentional headspace? Unable to connect deeper with yourself? Come, and together, let's address the elephant in the room. I'm your host, Sinead Roche, and this is the Uncomfortable Podcast. I am someone who constantly wants to improve. That's kind of the reason why I started the Uncomfortable Podcast, because I was just like, there's so many lessons to learn in life that are really shitty to go through, but you need to go through them to become a better person, to develop in the person you were meant to be, to build your character, to understand who you are better. Anyways, I just want to improve. And one habit that I one habit that I'm really big on is I kind of always notice when I have issues. And I love to take notice of them. I've always done this, and I can remember even when I was training to become a lacrosse goalie, right? When I started playing, I was just playing for fun, and I was really, 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 really bad at it. And at one point, I remember okay, now I want to actually do this. I actually want to get better at this. And what I started to do is every single time that I missed a shot, I would tell myself what I did wrong. Every single time. And when I did it badly though, no, not when I did badly, but when I actually caught a goal, and I did good, I wouldn't really highlight that to myself. I wouldn't really tell myself good job. I remember being really hype and excited about it, but it's not something that I would necessarily remind myself that I did good of. I would always remind myself of the things that went wrong so that I wouldn't do it next time, even if I messed up in a different way. And I don't just do this when it comes to sports, but I do this when it comes to honestly anything in my life where I realized that there's a problem, I've done something bad again, I think it helps me because it does make me really self-aware about things. But I think I tell myself my mistakes and my problems and my bad habits so often that I don't ever tell myself about the wins that I have in my life. And as someone who's, I've told you guys throughout all of these episodes, you have to you have to be really self-aware about what your habits are, and really mindful. But I've only been really mindful about my negative habits. And so today I want to talk to you guys about, I think, a big mistake we're all making when it comes to being self-proclaimed self-aware. Because being self-aware is not just about knowing your bad habits, but it's also about enunciating your wins and reminding yourself about the positive things and about the changes that you're making and that you're actually seeing results in. It's about highlighting those moments as well. And I think because I fixate so much on the negative ones, it leads me definitely to have a really negative view of myself, and so low self-esteem. And this has to do with the fact that when we constantly show ourselves only the bad things about us, we are framing ourselves to only see us as a project to work on and as someone with so many issues that it's just no wonder you're never getting to the place where you want to in life. No wonder you're never doing better because you have all these issues, What is framing, because I've just mentioned that, which is a big thing that happens when you're constantly just telling yourself that, now I have these control issues again, or now I'm crashing out again, which happens occasionally. But at the same time, you also have these good moments where it's just oh, I'm able to share how I feel. Oh, I'm able to ask people for help. Good moments that you're not highlighting. So let's get into what is framing. Framing is basically the way that we phrase a sentence. Put it to you like this. The easiest way to explain what framing is that, and we did this often in psychology class, is that when you look at what's it called? Hackfleisch. When you look at mincemeat, oh my gosh, mincemeat, we'll call it like that, in a store, you're usually going to see it with percentages of like, okay, 90% lean, right? Or you might see something like 10% fat. Both will give you the exact same ratio. If something is 10% fat, then the other percent is going to be 90% lean, right? But because it's phrased as 10% fat, you are more likely to choose the option of 90% lean. Because in your mind, it's like, oh, this is better, even though it's the same thing, you know? And if you apply that to yourself, like, okay, I have all of these issues, but I also, on the other hand, have all these positives with a side of issues, you know what I'm saying? Like, not to compare yourself to a meat package, but you're not highlighting both aspects, which show both the same thing, if that makes sense. Like the way you frame yourself in your own mind, and what heuristics and biases you have that are constantly being made available to yourself. And what do I mean by that is like the examples that you repetitively like put into your mind and like ingrain in your mind. Like if you are someone who constantly thinks about the mistakes that you've made in the past, then you're not really present about the way that you're growing, right? And so when someone asks you, like, perhaps like, are you a good person? Do you think you're a good person? The availability heuristic, which is what's working at that moment and like creating that kind of bias that you have towards yourself to frame yourself in a negative way, is the fact that you are going back to those past experiences because they're so available for you and they're so present for you. And because you've gone down that loop so many freaking repetitive times that when you then look at yourself, you're like, I'm actually not a good person, you know, like, let me not lie to you. Like, there's so much still I have to work on. And you haven't even looked at the fact that like, okay, presently today, like you've actually done so many things in a better manner than you would have compared to the past. So that's what we're dealing with when we are constantly like repetitively putting the same like bad habits that we've had in the past into our mind and reminding ourselves of them. Like, again, it's part of being self-aware, to tell yourself, like, hey, what were the problems that you've done wrong? But like, then you just frame yourself and look at yourself like, I'm a constant project to work on, or like, there's this issue and that issue. And I think that with all of that, like you start to instill like low self-esteem into yourself and even confidence who you are as a person. Because again, if you're just looking at yourself as something that is constantly a work in progress and you're never seeing the small wins, you're not going to necessarily have like the best view of yourself. And I do this so freaking often where it's gotten to the point where I literally like, there's lots of Post-its around my room. Like you see right here, and then I have a jar, which I'll show you guys in a second. And there's Post-its around my room where I literally have to remind myself like, oh, Sinead, like you've done this well. Like, and that sounds really stupid and silly, but for someone who is so prone to constantly being like, oh man, the past, like, I need to remind myself that I still have value and that my current actions today don't reflect who I was in the past. And that helps me to like really instill confidence because I'm highlighting my good deeds and my good actions to myself constantly. And, you know, with all of this said, like getting back to being self-aware, but only being negatively self-aware, I think it makes it hard to give yourself value and harder to give yourself credit when you are actually doing the current work. Because again, you're like, yeah, maybe you haven't fixed every single issue. And maybe there is a certain pattern that keeps on coming up for yourself, but you're just focusing on that. And I think it also just ingrains into your mind that like, you know, you're never going to get better. And that is 100% not the case. I think you get better every single day, like without realizing it. Okay, that's on. Okay, no, I do think you get 100% better because, you know, time is going on and hopefully like, you know, you're listening to these episodes and you're doing the work on yourself and you want to become better and you are making yourself aware of some of the bad issues that you've had. But I think when you do it to an extreme and you don't balance it out with also seeing the positives in your own life, then like you're just freaking hyper aware of every single mistake you make. And I think it's honestly also mentally unhealthy to not acknowledge also your positives. And I feel like right now I'm repeating myself a lot, but I think for people who always have this tendency, like, okay, like what's next? What's next? We don't ever take the moment to just be like, pause and be like, there's no way. Like, I'm actually handling this better than the person who I was in the past. And when we skip over those moments, we are denying ourselves a huge part that belongs to our character, who we are creating today. And I think we're denying ourselves that credit. And as I've mentioned, then like that might also help us with our own sense of value. So let's get into how do we make ourselves more positively self-aware as well. I literally would suggest start noting down the positives, literally. Over here, I have a jar. I mentioned this I didn't mention this specifically, but like I talked about this in my New Year's episode where I was like, okay, like I don't know what the theme of my year is going to be, but I'll get back to you guys. So let me get back to you guys. The theme of this year for me is going to be gratitude. I've started a gratitude jar with a few different types of notes that I write to myself every week. And something that I have is like something I appreciate about me. It's in pink because I like pink. And doing this, and even doing like the post-it notes around my room, like, and even purple has a different meaning. I love color coding as well. It really helps me to be like reinforcing that memory in my head. And again, that might sound silly to other people, but when you've had the pattern of just constantly beating yourself down, and thinking, okay, what's next, and exhausting yourself and thinking that you're like the worst project possible to like work on, it really does help. And it makes you also have to really think hard about like, what's something that I appreciate about myself, or what's something that I've acknowledged that I'm actually doing good. It makes you think, because there's been some times where I'm just like, oh my gosh, like, okay, do we count that? Oh. And then you start to realize even like how you're denying yourself sometimes even from writing certain things down, because it's just like, but it's not 100% yet. But it's just like, okay, that's fine. It's fine that we're not 100% at this like good behavior that we've somehow imagined in our head we need to be at. But like still acknowledge that there's some progress. Still acknowledge that. I think it's also really important to potentially have like accountability partners who encourage you to see your own positives. One thing I've noticed I do often with friends is like, I like to complain. Oh, gosh, I like to complain about everything, a lot of things. And it's kind of nice. Like I got reminded the other day, like by a really close friend of mine, that's just like, you also need to see the positives. Like, okay, what good is happening, and I don't just want to apply that to like when I'm telling her about like stuff in my life, but I also wanted to apply that just like to like when I'm sharing about myself, like when I'm learning about myself, like, yeah, I'm learning I have this problem, but I'm also learning that like I'm still able to communicate like openly, or have somewhat healthy confrontations. Like I'm able to still do that. So having someone who's also like keeping you accountable on some degree, hopefully don't become dependent on them, but like having someone help you in that, like definitely also helps like change and shift your mindset, and helps you become very self-aware about the good things in your life. So yeah. And I, again, have still a trouble time with this, which is why, again, you see lots of post-it notes around, and they change around my room, but that's completely fine. Like, that's completely normal, because it's going to take us a while, definitely, to change our own perspective that we have of ourselves. And so don't rush this, I think though, like when you start to actively like sit down and take the time to write out like what are the good things about you, I think you're gonna feel a lot more sense of pride and just value, and just like, oh, I never noticed this about myself. Like you might have those many like aha moments, because I know I have those. Yeah. But anyways, perhaps you did not think that this episode applied to you, and that might be the case. But for those of you who are thinking, okay, this really wasn't it, like I didn't really need to listen to these few minutes, I'd ask yourself, like, do you have a highlight reel of your growth? Or is the only thing that you think about yourself like a box of lessons that you need to keep learning? Because I think some of us just really store, again, all of our issues or all these uncomfortable lessons, that we don't store enough memories of like, hey, I did this and I'm really proud of myself, and I can acknowledge that without denying myself that feeling, and denying myself that like rush that goes to my self-esteem or something like this. Yeah. So at the end of this episode, like, ask yourself that question. But what I also want to do today is, again, because it is so hard, I am going to tell you something that I'm proud of myself about, like within this journey that we call life. And I hope that you also take the time, whether it be like 2 minutes or something like this, that you just tell yourself, like, what's something that you're proud of yourself right now, that even with all perhaps the bad and chaos that's going on around, like, what's something that you can be like, yeah, like I can appreciate this about myself. Because, you know, by the slowly taking those steps, we become more self-aware about the positives. And for myself, something that I am really proud about is I am proud that even now I can still communicate how I feel to other people. I've had a really, really, really rough month this past January, and a rough week, I would say, this week at least. And I'm glad that I'm still able to communicate to people how I feel about certain things, and also when things bother me. Yeah, so that's something I'm really glad that I'm able to do. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. Bye. Hey guys, thank you so much for supporting this week's episode of The Uncomfortable Podcast. Make sure to tune in every Monday for a new episode on Spotify and YouTube, and go check out our TikTok and Instagram for more content.